Welcome back for lecture number 4. And I've picked up a little bit of confusion about where the seminar is. The seminar is this afternoon at 2 o'clock in the university church. So you come back here, and it's upstairs in the old library. And there will be people here who will help you get there if you don't know where it is. So, with no more ado, let's welcome Rowan back for the final Bampton lecture.
I said that in this final lecture I'd talk a little bit about the themes of rights and dignity in connection with the idea of solidarity and some of the theological underpinning of that. And I turn yet again to the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church for one or two telling quotes about human rights here. The roots of human rights are to be found in the dignity that belongs to each human being. The ultimate source of human right is not found in the mere will of human beings, in the reality of the state, in public powers, but in man himself and in God, his creator. Human rights are to be defended not only individually but also as a whole. Protecting them only partially would imply a kind of failure to recognize them. In the construction of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, rather more than 70 years ago, theological voices played a larger part than you might expect. Both Catholic and Protestant thinkers in the United States contributed substantially to the drafting of the Universal Declaration, which makes it all the more odd that in the last decade or so, quite a number of very distinguished theologians in the English-speaking world have pushed back against human rights as an ideal or as an ideology. The voices of John Milbank and Oliver O'Donovan in particular have been very eloquent in challenging the way in which human rights language has been used and challenging some of the theological reappropriation of the language of rights on a number of interesting and not negligible grounds. There are problems with the way rights discourse has evolved, undoubtedly. What has most come in for criticism is what Oliver O'Donovan describes in one of his books as the construction of the human person as the abstract possessor of a certain number of entitlements. The abstract possessor of a certain number of entitlements. And it's that notion of an abstract individual that is most problematic for writers like O'Donovan. Milbank is more interested in the ambiguity, the complication of the language of possession. Who is it who possesses these rights, and what kind of a possession are human rights? Because possessions are something we may have or may not have. They come and go. And even if you say that human rights are inalienable, they still, if they're possessions, remain at arm's length from the subject as such. Criticisms of this sort are criticisms aimed both at the individualism of contemporary society, in many respects, and also at the way in which categories of ownership have come to dominate a good deal of our moral discussion. I can do what I like with my own body may end up as justifying a good many things which we would agree are justifiable. But in itself, it carries with it that uncomfortable suggestion that my body is one of those things I have rather than am. And if rights are conceived in the same mode as something I have rather than something involved in what I am, we have an issue there. Individualism and the model of possession, and therefore, as O'Donovan says, behind it all, an abstract person. All that being said, I want to resist some aspects of this critique of rights discourse. As I've sometimes said a little sharply in the past, challenging human rights is all very well if you happen to be doing it from a university chair of moral theology. It's perhaps less easy to do if you're in prison in South Sudan or if you're a woman in Afghanistan. We have the structure, the rhetoric, the protocols of human rights to enable us in certain circumstances precisely to insist on what the compendium describes in terms of what is not found in the will of human beings, in the reality of the state, or in public powers. We use the language of human rights often with a very, very limited and confused framework within which to make sense of it, so as to remind ourselves of the limits of human will and state power. To say that there are things about human beings which cannot be voted out of existence, that a majority opinion on the status of other human beings does not alter that status in the eyes of what the believer will call God and what the unbeliever doesn't quite know what to call. So, thinking of rights as the compendium does in relation to human dignity, I want to explore a little bit how notions of solidarity and right converge, and how they press us finally towards some of those theological themes that I have so tantalizing and annoyingly suggested I'm going to turn to at some point in this discussion. If solidarity, as I've been discussing it, is indeed involved with and embodied in linguistic exchange and the shared labor of constructing culture, then solidarity is bound to entail a commitment to releasing persons for making their own sense, or contributing freely to the sense-making that surrounds them. Liberating persons not as atomistic individuals with a given solitary private agenda, but as speaking collaborators, interagents, as you might say, interagents, who can legitimately expect time taken and attention given in the processes of social interaction. And to learn the habits of taking time and giving attention to other human subjects is, to put it ambitiously, a kind of love, in the sense that it treats the other as someone with an independent and, in some important respects, inaccessible and unrepeatable hinterland, which will take a lifetime to explore. The forms of human love that we most readily recognize, that love which entails lifelong embodied commitment, mean, as one will sometimes hear in sermons at weddings, a commitment never to suppose that you've got to the bottom of the other person, a commitment to spend unlimited time with another person. And, odd as it may sound, that spousal commitment is, as we might put it, the extreme end of a spectrum in which the taking of time and the giving of attention mark and characterize our relations. It's perhaps in that sense that one can say, it's a controversial perspective, that the values of the family are indeed the values of society. Not quite in the way some people would like to see it, but insofar as the values of the family are bound up with unrestricted time and unconditional attention, maybe there's something to be said about a spousal model as one of the forms of covenant that create a durable, intelligible society. If solidarity, as I say, entails shared work, if that work is the construction of culture, it will be durable, credible, legitimate, at the end of the day, if it's based on that fundamental reality of love. I said it was an ambitious word to use because, of course, the term generally in our usage doesn't work terribly well in the field of political thought. We don't instantly open our papers or our screens in the morning looking at the news of recent parliamentary debates and understand it in terms of the exchange of love. And yet there is, and there has to be, a sense in which durable culture creation is rooted in love, and in which we have to see love as interconnected with justice, to see love as a form of justice. If it's indeed the case that solidarity, in the wide sense I've been giving to the word, involves this reverent, time-taking understanding of the depth and the hinterland of the neighbour, then my giving of time and attention is my giving to the neighbour of what their reality merits and demands. It is an apt, a fitting response to the neighbour. It is, in short, just. And part of our problem in thinking about justice and using the word just is that we have perhaps over-legalized it. Vere dignum et justum ecum et salutare, says the preface in the Roman Mass. It is meet and right and our bounden duty in the prayer book. Dignum et justum. To give God worship is an act of justice. We are doing justice to God in worship. We give God what is fit, what is apt for God, which is adoration and unconditional openness to God. And so the apt, the fitting response to the human neighbour, and indeed the world that the human neighbour and I inhabit together, the fitting response is a just response to that mystery of life-giving in which I am involved. Now, discussion of human rights does often turn on the concept of jus in Latin. And in medieval Latin, jus is very much to do with the freedom to perform certain kinds of act or to demand certain kinds of reaction. But behind it lurks this deeper sense, liturgical and biblical, of a justness, a proper alignment, or as I very much like to say, a proper attunement to the real. And if that's the case, human right, let's not talk about human rights for the moment, but human right is precisely the requirement, the invitation to respond with proper alignment, just alignment to what is there, to what is real. And that is inseparable from our alignment to the reality of God. In St. Augustine's City of God, Augustine has a rather surprising chapter on pagan religion, in which he polemicizes against the sacrifices of pagan cults on the grounds that they are unjust. They are responding inappropriately, ineptly, you might say, to reality by giving what is less than God a worship that is justly due to God alone. But, even more surprisingly, he goes on to say that the sacrifice of the pagans to idols is an injustice to the pagan worshippers. They are not being set free to respond aptly or justly or truly to the real, and therefore they themselves are not able to be what they should be. To turn someone from idolatry to true faith is not just a matter of clocking up a convert or two. It's a matter of enabling someone to do justice to God and to have justice done to them. Whatever you make of Augustine's polemic against Varro and other apologists for the pagan cults of the day, the point is an intriguing one. To be set free for worship is somehow to be set free to have justice done to oneself. It is to take oneself, you might say, with appropriate seriousness and to invite others to do so. And so it is that drawing out some of what I've been sketching around the theme of solidarity gives us something of a key for reimagining justice in terms of what is due to God and to the image of God in the world. And if justice is reconceived in those terms, then jus, right, human rights, becomes something a little more relational, a little more imaginative than merely the apportioning of what is agreed to be, as it were, forensically due. I touched on the theme of the image of God in the third lecture very briefly. If the point of the world's diversity is the immeasurable diversity of the ways in which life from God can be mediated, the image of God, particularly, uniquely in the human, is not a matter of some qualities that elevate humanity above the rest of creation, but to say that in humanity, the mediation of life is particularly intense and bound up with our consciousness of one another. It's a giving of life which is fully bound up with the subject's dignity and the subject's liberty, which is not to say that that transmission of life is not present elsewhere in the creation. But this is where, once again, returning to the phraseology of the Compendium of Social Doctrine, the idea of human dignity does indeed become crucial to the idea of human right. Human dignity not simply as an incomprehensible, rather arbitrary specification of the difference, the singularity of humanity, but human dignity as bound up with this particular summons to the human to be consciously and incrementally involved in a response to the gift of God, which releases the life that comes from God with particular intensity within the world. And because of that particular intensity of intention, direction, and love, when it goes wrong, it's the human being who can do more damage to the world than any other part of creation, as you may have noticed. In a paradoxical way, to underline the specialness of the image of God as life mediating within the human family is a way of flagging up just how dangerous human beings are in the environment. If this is wrong, turned back on itself, bound up in the corporate self-service of the human family alone, let alone the human individual alone, we have an issue. So, solidarity conceived in relation to this just and loving mutuality, this mediation of life to one another within the global community. Solidarity puts before us the idea of a network of reverence, patience, time-taking between agents in creation, an awareness of the impenetrable mysteriousness of the other's hinterland, and a gratitude for life-giving. I spoke in the second lecture about the significance of the inaccessibility of the other embodied subject, the other with whom we never come to the end of what is possible, what is to be discovered. And that means that in the process, the network of mutual life-giving, that is the human family, the human community, in the pattern of solidarity and koinonia, communion that has been sketched, the depth that is recognized in the other is a key point, a key insight. It's that depth, of course a metaphorical phrase, but one that's important, that depth in the other that makes imperative the spending of unrestricted time, the promise of unrestricted attentiveness. It's that which makes difference within the human world irreducible. It's that which pushes back against all those elements in our human interaction which tempt us, which lure us to a premature consolidation, harmonization, homogenization of the human. Not in the name of an individualism which regards the absolute sanctity of the individual as the only thing that matters, but in the name of that network of connection, mutuality, which means every point matters in creating the entire pattern. But it takes us back repeatedly to the image, the awareness of what is sometimes called the excess in the other person. The depth of inaccessibility, the depth of what is not spoken. We relate to one another, we exist only in relation to one another, and yet in that relation discover what is not exhausted within the relation. Certainly, as again has been said in a number of ecclesial documents on this subject, the sense of excess in the other means that it's impossible ever to regard the other simply as instrumental to the self. And part of any language about the image of God in this context of solidarity is a way of denying the instrumentalizing of any human being or any class of human beings. No one is, so to speak, made for the purposes of another. And all human power stands under that critique and that challenge. As I was hinting in part in the last lecture, doing justice is resisting the functionalizing of other human beings or other communities, resisting the way in which certain communities assume and often exercise a supposed right to dominate and define the other. And that's why, as I've said in the last lecture and the lecture before that, the point of an ethic of solidarity, and a theologically informed ethic of solidarity, is not in the least to subordinate particular perspectives to a generality. It's to be committed to a process, a constantly self-critical and self-reforming process of releasing in the other the resource that is to be shared. And that's a task we perform for one another, not a task performed by one superior class for the other, the liberators and the liberated, the actors and the acted upon. It's why in any kind of emancipatory movement worth the name, it's crucial that the process of liberation, the process of emancipation, is one that is not activated from outside, but is in some way released from within. One doesn't come in with the emancipatory solutions one thinks will apply to the other. One listens and works with the emancipatory potential that is there and how it is already working. And when that resource to be shared has been released, that, as I said not long ago, is not the end but the beginning of the story of common labour, the negotiation of common culture, as I've outlined it. Now, those are some of the ways in which I would want to start rethinking a theology of human rights, to try to tease it away a little bit from a theology which takes for granted the model of the individual with entitlements, to rethink it in terms of the dignity of life-giving and the processes by which that is released and by which obstacles to that reality are challenged and ideally removed. In that sense, I would hope that there could be a language about rights that was not quite so vulnerable to the critique of an O'Donovan or a Milbank of the abstractness of the human being presupposed by the language of rights. There could be a more active, a more imaginative construction of the idea of right in terms of justice, in terms of justice as the apt, appropriate, fully aligned response to what is real. And that's where, finally, we move into some of the most obviously and nakedly theological considerations surrounding this. The world we live in is, in this perspective, itself a world of solidarity, a world of exchange, a world of unceasing adjustment to what is other, receiving and transmitting life. A world in which, while there are points within the network one can identify, identity, nonetheless, is not a matter of unchanging, absolutely given singularity, but is always defined relationally. And for the Christian believer, that inevitably leads to a few thoughts about the nature of what it is that upholds, surrounds, and makes sense of the universe. That is the divine life. What if the oneness, the singleness of the divine were not, after all, the singleness of an individual? What if God is not the name of a person somewhere else? What if God is the name of that which solidarity distantly reflects? A life which is intrinsically mutual, a life which is never still in the sense of static, a life which is unchangingly a life of exchange. Christian doctrines of God as Trinity are an attempt to speak about the divine, the unconditioned, in terms drawn from the history of revelation, which lead us to the sometimes baffling and extremely difficult to clarify and categorize conclusion that the divine, the unconditioned, is not one in the sense of mere arithmetical unity. And for what it's worth, and it's worth quite a bit actually, the discussion of divine unity in St. Thomas Aquinas underlines precisely this point. St. Thomas rather neatly says that where we're talking about divine unity, it's crucial to remember the difference between arithmetical unity and metaphysical unity. Arithmetical unity is to say there is one alarm clock on the lectern. There might be others. There are other alarm clocks elsewhere. There is a single alarm clock on this lectern. One instance of a kind of subject or substance which happens to be there. The one thing one can clearly say about the unity of God is that it can't be like that. There doesn't happen to be one God, as if there might be others, but there aren't. There is one God for metaphysical reasons, not mathematical ones, says St. Thomas. And that means that when we speak about the oneness of God, we are, and it's a frequent theme in Thomas, we are much more involved in denying certain things about the divine than asserting. We're saying that God is not a committee, that God is not the result of a process, that God is not a compound of pre-existing substances, that the unconditioned is exactly what unconditioned says. But when St. Thomas turns a bit later, in a very interesting passage in this discussion in the Summa, to the question, is God the supreme or maximal form of unity? He says, well, we have it on good authority, he quotes St. Bernard, we have it on good authority that the Holy Trinity is the highest form of unity. Meaning by that the mutuality of divine life, as spelled out in Trinitarian doctrine, tells us what unity, theologically speaking, most basically is. Not the unity of a single example of a genus, but the inseparability, the timeless interwovenness of a kind of diversity. Our words run out when we try to specify it, and Pseudo-Dionysius, in his treatise on mystical theology, at the end of it, as it were, shrugs his shoulders on the page to say, neither one nor three as we do enumeration. Neither one nor three as we do enumeration. So my argument ultimately, I think, opens out onto that perspective. We are, as we reflect on the theological content and the theological resonance of the language of solidarity, we are pushed to ask questions about the context, the metaphysical context, within which we speak of this finite world as a world of interaction. And to see it as, in some sense, reflective of, continuous with, participating in a life which, as the ground, the context, the final purpose of the finite world, is itself characterized in some complex sense by interaction, by solidarity, by the communion of the Holy Spirit, as you might say. Or to put it the other way around, the solidarity we seek of mutuality is a finite and unsatisfactory, limited reflection of something about the infinite. I say to put it that way round because I'm not one of those who believes that you can do a sensible Trinitarian theology by, so to speak, projecting created diversity onto God and saying that the divine life manages diversity better than we do. God is not a particularly successful committee, or even a particularly successful family or friendship, not a case of anything. But if what we say about the unity of the unconditioned is that it is never the unity of an atomized individual, we have some ground for saying that what we seek in mutuality, in life-giving and interdependence, in active solidarity, in the work of solidarity, is, to use a well-known phrase coined by somebody who was a student not very far from here, the moving image of eternity. And in our practice of solidarity as Christian believers, we have as our context, as the ground of our thinking and our praying, that particular vision of divine unity, which allows us to understand our liturgical life, our common work in liturgy, as itself, in some sense, fleshing out solidarity in a particularly determining and defining way. We gather out of diversity into the singleness, but not the isolation, of the assembly. We understand ourselves, gathered liturgically as Christians. We understand ourselves as a community in which we depend upon one another and in which we are characterized by common need or common hunger. We do very literally satisfy that common need and common hunger with the food that is the living, embodied recollection of God's work with us, the body and blood of Christ. We recognize as we gather the importance of beginning with an act of penitence, which acknowledges and, so to speak, parks or sidelines the habitual ways in which we are separated from one another. For these purposes, at the Eucharistic Assembly, we are not defined by where we have come from and who we think we are, but by the fact of divine invitation and the fact of shared need. In that act of absorbing the life given to us, in that embodied recollection of the incarnate Word, in our response to that, we restore our dignity, our vocation, our capacity for creating a culture. The Eucharist creates culture. It creates a set of assumptions, images, imaginings about the human in which we serve and give life to one another. Gregory Dix, famously in his great classic On the Shape of the Liturgy, talks about the Eucharist creating Homo Eucharisticus, not just Homo sapiens, a human being defined by Eucharistic communion, by a particular kind of solidarity, a communion with the divine, a communion with one another. And what, therefore, ultimately defines or characterizes the Church is precisely a solidarity of communion with the divine and with one another in an inseparable way, a life which does justice to God and to God's creation in the same act. And the Church's presence in the world, so far from being a presence that seeks to dominate or control the world in the name of a divine monarch, the Church's presence in the world becomes the Church's identity and integrity as a sign of the possibility of life in solidarity, solidarity without enemies. You won't need me to remind you that the Church's success in living this out is patchy. Nonetheless, if there is any rationale for the Church being there at all, it is this. It is the presence of life in solidarity with this ultimately Trinitarian hinterland. A good deal more might be said about that, and on another occasion with more time I'd be glad to explore it further. But I wanted in this final lecture to lead up to this conclusion, that our concern about solidarity as Christians is finally a concern that the divine life be lived within creation as God intends it to be lived, that the life of finite agents together be a life of mutual reverence and patience and life-giving. I asked in the last lecture why we should bother about the culture-creating work of solidarity. And the answer I hinted at there was, apart from the pragmatics, there is something here about the rediscovery or realignment with the fundamental character of the created order, as mutual, as interdependent. And if that's the fundamental character of the created order, the distinctive calling and the distinctive gift of the human within that is to give it word and form, to give it intelligibility of a certain kind, so that it may be spoken and heard and answered in the world of incipient, frustrated, partial solidarity within it which we live. Incipient and fragmented solidarity. Those are terms which would be, I think, a quite polite description of the various crises in the middle of which we live nationally and globally at the moment. We live in a world of profoundly damaged and fractured solidarity with the rest of the material creation. We live in a world where so often the appeal of political rhetoric is to identities preserved at the expense of other identities. We live in a world in which the long legacy of enslavement and empire weighs heavily on communities which we inhabit and to which we are neighbours, and a world in which some of the most pervasive and powerful models of human fulfillment have to do with realizing inner agendas that have no relation to or interdependence with the agendas of neighbours. In that world where the distinctiveness of the human and the possibilities of communion are so repeatedly, systematically damaged, we can speak at best of an incipient solidarity, and yet we can say that it is incipient for the mere reason that, as I said in the last lecture, there are goods and concerns which are irreducibly common, which we cannot begin to understand except as shared tasks in the face of shared challenges. The importance in our world at the moment of a church, and let's add to that a theologically informed church, which takes solidarity seriously and understands it as the cornerstone of a credible Christian ethic. The importance of church and theology in our modern context is of some considerable urgency. We need, as the last lecture suggested, we need programs and practices which increasingly impel us to the spending of time and the giving of attention. We need the patience that recognizes how we learn, how we have learned, how we commit ourselves to learning again. And above all, we need those disciplines which will bring us back to interrogating ceaselessly the ways in which we seek to evade the compromises and the labors of conversation, the frustratingly protracted and conflict-laden character of our learning. But if this analysis is anything like correct, then to turn our backs on solidarity as a possibility and an imperative, the virtue of solidarity which uncovers the reality of solidarity, to go back to my first lecture, to turn our backs on that is to turn our backs on being human, on both the challenges and the promise of a shared humanity. I would hope that one of the things which the Church most urgently seeks to do in the context of our contemporary world is perhaps very simply to identify, to name, to challenge all those things which make the abandonment of our humanity seem like an attractive option. Whether those things be the zero-sum rhetoric of online debate, the complicated and not very edifying love affair with artificial intelligence, the seductions of post-humanist or transhumanist rhetoric about the possibilities of disembodied futures for our disembodied minds, and, of course, our complacency about the diverse forms of violence, hegemonic imbalance, and oppression that so characterize so much of our world. Solidarity is indeed, as Tishner and others argued, a matter of discovering what work we have to do and believing in the possibility of work together, believing in the possibility and the necessity of culture creation. It's a point that's been made more than once in recent years that sometimes we're very tempted to solve the problems of our divisions by legal rather than cultural means. And we know by now that mere regulation will not stand in for a lack of cultural construction and cultural transformation. The Christian Church is a culture, among other things. Sadly, it's often a subculture, a hobby which is attractive to a certain number of rather eccentric individuals that one would rather not spend train journeys with. But a culture it is, in the sense of a framework of habit and imagination, which allows us to hope for transformed relationship. If the Church works at its culture and engages as best it can with the culture around, it will be part of that process of transformational solidarity, which I believe we are called to as human beings, which I believe we are so urgently in need of at the moment, and which I hope these lectures may have made some small contribution to bringing into focus and raising awareness of where we need to go and the labour that lies ahead of us. And for your own willingness to share the labour of listening through the process of these lectures, I'm deeply grateful for your reactions already. I'm very appreciative. I look forward very much to further discussion this afternoon with as many of you as can manage it. So thank you once again.
Rowan, on behalf of everyone who's gathered here this week, last week, and online, thank you for these enormously rich Bampton lectures. You have addressed some, we might even say most, of the deeply pressing issues that we face today, and you've done that with an anthropological, a sociological, ethical, and theological analysis, and you have urged us to face those challenges by forging solidarity in all things and doing the work, capital T, capital W. So for those of us who can come to the seminar at 2 p.m, we look forward to more conversation with you about this. But all of us here, last week, this week, online, and those who will view the recorded lectures, I know look forward to the rich book which will surely flow from these wonderful and indeed provocative lectures. So a huge thanks from all of us. Thank you.